It was a bright afternoon outside the school gates. The bell had just rung, and students poured out, their laughter and chatter filling the air. Amid the bustling crowd, a black girl stood alone, clutching her notebook and waiting for her father. Her posture was proud, her gaze steady, even as some of her classmates whispered and glanced her way. She had learned to ignore the stares, the subtle smirks. This wasn't new to her. But what happened next was. A police officer, stationed nearby to oversee the school's dismissal, suddenly zeroed in on her. His steps were heavy and deliberate as he approached, his voice sharp enough to cut through the noise. "Hey, you! What do you think you're doing hanging around here?" His words were laced with something darker than authority, an edge of contempt that turned heads. The students began to quiet, a tense hush falling over the crowd. "I'm waiting for my dad," she replied, her voice steady but cautious. "Your dad, huh?" he sneered, his hand resting on his belt. "Or are you waiting for trouble? You look like the type to bring it." The girl froze, her knuckles whitening as she gripped her notebook tighter. "I'm not doing anything wrong. Not doing anything wrong." He let out a laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "You people always have an excuse. Empty your bag, now." She hesitated, glancing at the growing crowd of onlookers. The humiliation clawed at her throat, but she complied, slowly opening her backpack. It contained nothing but school supplies, but the officer wasn't satisfied. "Turn out your pockets. Hands where I can see them," he barked. Her voice trembled now, anger and shame battling within her. "I haven't done anything wrong. Why are you doing this to me?" "Because someone like you doesn't belong standing here," he snapped, grabbing her bag and tossing it aside. It landed in a nearby trash can with a loud thud. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Laughter, awkward and cruel, followed from some of the students who watched. Tears stung her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She stood her ground, despite the crushing weight of everyone's stares. That was when the officer took a step closer, his voice lowering into a menacing growl. "You think you're better than this?" he said. "You're nothing. Remember that." The girl didn't respond. She didn't flinch. But inside, a storm raged. Unbeknownst to the officer, someone else had been watching. A man stepped out from his parked car across the street, his face a mask of quiet fury. He had seen everything, every word, every action. He didn't move immediately. Instead, he observed, calculating, his mind already piecing together what had to come next. Because this wasn't just a father watching his daughter get humiliated. This was an FBI agent witnessing an abuse of power. And he wasn't going to let it slide. The officer, oblivious to the storm he had just unleashed, smirked as he turned away, confident he had asserted his authority. Confident the girl, and everyone watching, would remember his dominance. But he had no idea what was coming. What could a father, an FBI agent with decades of experience, do to ensure justice for his daughter? What secrets about the officer's past could surface to destroy the very foundation of his authority? And how would one moment of cruelty unravel a chain of events that would change everything? You're about to find out. Stay with us. This is just the beginning. Hello, dear viewer. At Plough of Twist, we stand firmly against all forms of racism and discrimination. Our stories aim to shed light on the struggles and resilience of individuals who face injustice, while inspiring change and empowerment. To every Black viewer watching, know that your worth is immeasurable, and your voice matters. Together, we can build a world rooted in equality and respect. We hope you enjoy today's story, a tale of courage, justice, and redemption. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and join us in spreading these impactful narratives. Now, let's dive into this powerful journey. Enjoy! The sun was setting over the small suburban town of Brookhaven, casting a golden glow over the tree-lined streets and neatly trimmed lawns. It was a place where the air smelled of freshly cut grass, and the sound of kids laughing and playing echoed through the neighborhoods. But beneath its picturesque surface, Brookhaven held on to the same fractures and biases that rippled through much of the country. At the heart of this story was Maya Thompson, a 15-year-old girl with dreams bigger than the world she lived in. Maya was sharp, thoughtful, and carried herself with a quiet confidence. She loved literature and science, devoured books on astrophysics, and had a dream of one day working for NASA. Her classmates often underestimated her, mistaking her reserved nature for shyness. But Maya wasn't shy, she was observant. She noticed the way teachers seemed quicker to discipline students like her. She noticed the quiet whispers and stolen glances when she raised her hand to answer a question, always accurate, always concise. Maya lived with her father, David Thompson, an FBI agent who was every bit as meticulous and sharp as his daughter. David was a man of few words, but when he spoke, his voice carried authority. He was respected in his field, known for his ability to remain calm under pressure and for solving cases others deemed unsolvable. But at home, David was a father first. He'd raised Maya on his own after her mother passed away from a sudden illness when Maya was just 7. Their bond was unshakable, built on mutual respect and a shared love of knowledge. While David's job kept him busy, he never missed an opportunity to remind Maya of her worth, teaching her to stand tall in a world that often sought to diminish girls like her. Their home was modest but warm, filled with bookshelves stacked high with novels and case files, and a kitchen that smelled of cinnamon pancakes on the weekends. Maya's room was her sanctuary, a small corner of the house painted in soft lilac, with a telescope by the window and posters of nebulae and galaxies on the walls. To her, the stars represented endless possibilities, a world far removed from the confines of Brookhaven. On the other side of this story stood Officer Ethan Crowley, a man whose presence cast a shadow over the community. Crowley was the kind of cop who patrolled with a chip on his shoulder, his uniform a badge of power rather than service. He was known for being hard-nosed and unyielding, often targeting the town's black and brown residents with thinly veiled justifications. His name was spoken in hushed tones, his reputation one of intimidation and unchecked authority. Crowley's approach to law enforcement had made him enemies, but his superiors often turned a blind eye, chalking his behavior up to necessary toughness. The incident that brought these lives crashing together began, as many do, with something seemingly ordinary. Maya had stayed after school to tutor a younger student, a gig she'd picked up to save for a summer science program. The session ran a bit longer than expected, and by the time she stepped outside, the buses had left, and the crowd of students had thinned. She waited by the school gates, her backpack slung over one shoulder, clutching a novel she had been reading in her free moments. David had promised to pick her up after a late meeting at the field office. Though she trusted him to be on time, she kept glancing at her watch, aware of the other kids lingering nearby. A group of boys from her class stood a few yards away, laughing and shoving each other playfully. Their laughter stopped when Officer Crowley approached. Crowley had been stationed at the school recently, part of an initiative to increase police presence in schools, a decision that had sparked mixed feelings in the community. He strolled with an air of superiority, his eyes scanning the students like a predator sizing up its prey. When his gaze landed on Maya, something flickered in his expression. Maya noticed his approach out of the corner of her eye and stiffened. She hadn't done anything wrong, but she knew that didn't always matter. Crowley's shadow fell over her as he came to a stop, his presence imposing. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his tone sharp and accusing. Maya looked up, her brow furrowing in confusion. "I'm waiting for my dad to pick me up." Crowley crossed his arms, his eyes narrowing. "You shouldn't be loitering. Kids like you cause trouble when they hang around too long." "Kids like me?" Maya repeated, her voice steady despite the knot forming in her stomach. "I'm just waiting. I'm not causing any trouble." "Don't get smart with me," Crowley snapped, his hand resting on his belt. "Turn out your pockets. Now." Maya blinked, caught off guard. Why? I didn't do anything. Don't argue, he barked, his voice rising. Just do it. The group of boys watched, their laughter replaced by wide-eyed silence. One of them pulled out his phone, recording the encounter from a safe distance. Reluctantly, Maya placed her book on the ground and turned out her pockets, revealing a couple of crumpled dollar bills and a piece of gum. Crowley wasn't satisfied. He grabbed her backpack and rummaged through it, pulling out her notebook and tossing the bag into the nearby trash can. Maya froze, her cheeks burning with humiliation as the boys snickered. I told you, she said, her voice trembling with barely contained anger, I didn't do anything. Crowley leaned in closer, his voice low but venomous. You're just another smart-mouthed kid who thinks they're better than everyone else. Maybe this'll teach you some respect. Maya didn't say another word. She stood there, motionless, as he turned and walked away, his boots crunching against the gravel. Her fingers curled into fists, but she refused to cry, refused to give him the satisfaction. Across the street, David Thompson sat in his car, having arrived just moments before. He'd seen everything, the way Crowley singled her out, the way he dismissed her dignity like it was worthless. David's jaw tightened, his fists gripping the steering wheel as a flood of emotions surged through him. This wasn't just a father's outrage. This was an agent's instinct. And as he stepped out of the car, his mind was already racing, calculating what needed to be done to ensure Crowley would never abuse his power again. But for now, he walked toward Maya, his face calm, his expression giving nothing away. The storm brewing inside him could wait. He had a daughter to comfort first. David Thompson walked across the street, his measured steps concealing the storm raging within him. As he reached Maya, he could see the tension in her stance, the defiance in her eyes mixed with the simmering anger she was trying to hold back. For a moment, he simply placed a hand on her shoulder, grounding her, giving her the silent reassurance that she wasn't alone. Dad, she finally said, her voice a mix of relief and frustration. Did you see? I saw, he interrupted gently, his tone calm but firm. We'll talk about it in the car. Maya nodded, her fingers tightening around the notebook she still held. As they walked toward the car, David cast a glance back at the officer, who was now leaning casually against his cruiser, chatting with a group of parents as if nothing had happened. It took every ounce of restraint David had to keep walking. Now wasn't the time for confrontation. Not yet. Once inside the car, the silence hung heavy between them. David started the engine and pulled away from the school, his eyes flickering to the rearview mirror where Maya sat quietly, staring out the window. He let the silence linger, knowing she needed space to gather her thoughts. Finally, she spoke. Why does this keep happening, Dad? David's grip on the steering wheel tightened. It shouldn't, he said after a pause, his voice low. But it does. And that's why we can't let it slide. Maya turned to look at him. What are you going to do? He met her gaze in the mirror, his expression unreadable. First, I need you to tell me everything. Every word he said, every action. Don't leave anything out. Maya recounted the incident in detail, her voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. David listened intently, his mind cataloging every detail, piecing together the events like a puzzle. When she finished, he nodded, his expression thoughtful. You did the right thing by staying calm, he said. But now it's my turn to make sure this doesn't happen again. That night, after Maya had gone to bed, David sat in his home office, the glow of his laptop casting shadows across the room. He pulled up the police department's personnel files, a privilege granted by his position, and began his research. Ethan Crowley's name appeared quickly, along with a list of commendations and disciplinary reports. The commendations didn't interest David. It was the reports he focused on, excessive force complaints, incidents of racial profiling, all dismissed or swept under the rug. David leaned back in his chair, his jaw tightening. Crowley wasn't just a bad cop, he was a liability, protected by a system that allowed him to operate without consequence. But this time, things would be different. David had resources, connections, and, most importantly, the truth on his side. The next day, David made a call to an old colleague, Sarah Mitchell, a journalist with a reputation for exposing corruption. She listened carefully as David explained the situation, her silence indicating the gravity of what he was sharing. "This isn't just about Maya," David said. "Crowley has a pattern of behavior, and it's time someone held him accountable." Sarah hesitated. "You know this could get messy, right? If you're planning to take this public, you'll be stepping on some powerful toes." David's voice was steady. "I've faced worse." Sarah sighed. "All right. Send me what you have. But be careful, David. This could blow up in ways you can't predict." Over the next few days, David worked tirelessly, compiling evidence and connecting dots. He interviewed community members who had crossed paths with Crowley, uncovering stories of harassment and intimidation that mirrored Maya's experience. Each account painted a clearer picture of a man who thrived on wielding his authority like a weapon. Meanwhile, at school, Maya found herself at the center of unwanted attention. The video of her encounter with Crowley had spread, shared among students and even parents. Some offered her quiet words of support, while others avoided her entirely, unwilling to get involved. The boys who had laughed during the incident now avoided her gaze, their guilt written across their faces. Maya's best friend, Olivia, was one of the few who stood by her side. "You're braver than I would have been," Olivia said one afternoon as they walked home. "I don't know how you didn't just scream at him." "I wanted to," Maya admitted. "But what good would it have done? People like him, they don't listen." Olivia hesitated. "Do you think your dad's going to do something?" Maya nodded. "He's not the kind of person who lets things slide." At the police station, Crowley went about his days with the same swagger, oblivious to the storm brewing around him. But cracks were beginning to show. Rumors of an investigation had started to circulate, and Crowley noticed the way some of his colleagues avoided him in the break room. Still, he dismissed it as paranoia. After all, he'd faced complaints before, and nothing had ever come of them. But this time was different. This time, David Thompson was involved. David's investigation uncovered more than just Crowley's misconduct, it revealed a network of complicity within the department. Supervisors who had ignored red flags, internal affairs officers who had dismissed complaints without proper review. It was a web of negligence that allowed officers like Crowley to thrive, and David knew that exposing it would require precision. Late one night, as David sifted through his notes, Maya appeared in the doorway of his office. She hesitated before stepping inside. "Dad?" He looked up, his expression softening. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" I don't want you to get in trouble because of me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. David stood, crossing the room to place a hand on her shoulder. "This isn't just about you, Maya. It's about making sure no one else has to go through what you did. I'm not afraid of the consequences." Maya nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Okay." As the days passed, the tension in Brookhaven grew palpable. Whispers of David's investigation reached the community, sparking both hope and fear. Some supported his efforts, while others worried about the potential fallout. But David remained steadfast, his focus unwavering. And then, the breakthrough came. A piece of evidence so damning, so irrefutable, that it had the power to unravel everything Crowley had built. David stared at the file in his hands, his heart pounding as he realized the implications. This wasn't just about one bad cop, this was about a system that had allowed him to operate unchecked. But how could he reveal the truth in a way that ensured justice was served? And how would Crowley react when he realized his carefully constructed facade was about to crumble? David knew the answers to those questions would come soon enough. For now, he could only prepare for the storm that was about to break. The morning light filtered through the blinds of David's office as he sat at his desk, the damning file spread before him. He had spent the entire night reviewing it, ensuring every detail was airtight. The evidence didn't just incriminate Crowley, it exposed a chain of cover-ups implicating multiple officers and even higher-ups in the department. David knew this was his moment, the point of no return. Once this file was released, there would be no going back. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. The stakes were immense, but the image of Maya standing alone at that school gate, her dignity discarded like trash, burned in his mind. That moment wasn't just about her, it was about every person who had ever been dehumanized by a system that was supposed to protect them. His phone buzzed, breaking the heavy silence. It was Sarah. "David," she said, her voice tense. "I got your file. This is explosive." "I know," he replied. "Are you ready to run it?" "I'm ready," she said, but hesitated. "Are you?" David's jaw tightened. "It's not about me, Sarah. This has to come out." "All right," she said. "I'll publish it at noon. But, David, be careful. Once this is live, you'll be a target." "I can handle it," he said firmly, ending the call. David stood, stretching his stiff shoulders before heading into the kitchen. Maya was at the table, her nose buried in a book. She looked up when he entered, studying his face. "Is everything okay?" she asked. "It will be," he said, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "How's your homework?" "Done," she said, though her tone was distracted. "Dad, are you sure about this?" "About all of it?" He sat across from her, his expression softening. "Maya, sometimes doing the right thing isn't easy. Sometimes it's messy and complicated. But it's still the right thing." She nodded slowly, her fingers tracing the edges of her book. "I trust you." Those 3 words settled something deep within him. He reached across the table, squeezing her hand gently. At noon, the article went live. Sarah had crafted it meticulously, detailing the systemic failures that had allowed Crowley to operate unchecked for years. The piece included testimonies from community members, evidence of falsified reports, and internal emails that showed deliberate cover-ups. Within minutes, the story began to spread, igniting a firestorm on social media and news outlets. At the Brookhaven police station, Crowley was in the middle of his shift when the news broke. He felt the shift in the air almost immediately, the sidelong glances from his colleagues, the murmurs that stopped when he entered the room. It wasn't until his phone buzzed incessantly with notifications that he realized something was wrong. "Officer Crowley," the captain's voice rang out from across the room. "In my office. Now." Crowley stiffened, but he followed the command. Inside the office, the captain was seated behind his desk, his face grim. A printed copy of Sarah's article lay in front of him. "Care to explain this?" the captain asked, his tone sharp. Crowley's eyes scanned the headline, his stomach sinking. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice rising. "It's a smear campaign. Nothing but lies." "Is it?" the captain shot back. "Because there are documents in here that look pretty real to me. Complaints, emails, patterns of behavior that you never disclosed." Crowley clenched his fists. "You're going to take the word of some journalist over me? I've been on this force for years." "And that's the problem," the captain said coldly. "You've had too many years to build this mess. IA is opening an investigation immediately. Until then, you're suspended." Crowley's face turned red, his voice a growl. "This is a witch hunt. You can't do this to me." "I just did," the captain said, gesturing to the door. "Turn in your badge and gun." Crowley stormed out, slamming the door behind him. The eyes of his fellow officers followed him as he emptied his locker, his anger palpable. But underneath the rage was something else, fear. For the first time, he felt the weight of the walls closing in. Meanwhile, David watched the fallout unfold from the safety of his office. The article had done its job, and now the real fight would begin. But he wasn't done yet. He had one more move to make. Later that evening, as the town buzzed with the news, David parked his car outside the police station. Maya had begged him not to confront Crowley directly, but he knew this moment was necessary. He stepped inside, his presence commanding as he walked through the corridors. Officers glanced his way, their expressions a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Crowley was in the hallway, his locker open, his belongings scattered on the bench. When he saw David, his eyes narrowed. "You've got some nerve showing up here," Crowley snarled. David stopped a few feet away, his expression calm but unyielding. "I thought you'd like to meet the man who brought you down." Crowley laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "You think you're a hero, don't you? You think you've won." "This was never about winning," David said evenly. "It's about justice. Something you forgot a long time ago." Crowley stepped closer, his voice low and dangerous. "You don't know who you're messing with." "No," David said, his voice steady. "You don't. But you're about to find out." For a moment, they stared at each other, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Then David turned and walked away, leaving Crowley standing in the wreckage of his own making. Outside, the air was cool and still. David paused, taking a deep breath. This was only the beginning, but for the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope. The system wasn't fixed, not yet, but the cracks were starting to show. And for Maya, for everyone like her, it was a start. And yet, even as he drove home, David couldn't shake the feeling that Crowley wasn't done. The fight wasn't over. Not yet. The days following the article's release were a whirlwind for Brookhaven. The town, once quiet and complacent, was now alive with murmurs of scandal, protests, and demands for accountability. The media frenzy surrounding Crowley's suspension brought reporters to the small suburban town, their cameras and microphones turning its streets into a stage. David watched it all unfold with cautious satisfaction. The wheels of justice were turning, but he knew they moved slowly, and the road ahead would not be without obstacles. At home, Maya remained glued to her phone, reading comment after comment on the article. There were messages of support, stories from others who had faced similar injustices, and a flood of outrage aimed at Crowley. But there were also voices of doubt, people defending the officer or questioning her story. "Why do they think I'd make this up?" Maya asked one evening, her frustration bubbling over. "It's all right there in the article, the proof. Why don't they believe it?" David looked up from his laptop, where he was tracking the latest developments. "Some people don't want to believe," he said. "They'd rather cling to their version of the world than face the truth." "It's not fair," Maya muttered, slumping back into the couch. "None of this is fair." David crossed the room and sat beside her, his tone gentle but firm. "It's not. But fairness isn't something we can count on, Maya. That's why we fight. To make things better, even if it's hard." Maya nodded, though the weight of it all still sat heavily on her shoulders. "Do you think he'll actually face consequences?" David hesitated. "I think we've given the system everything it needs to hold him accountable. Whether it does or not, that's out of our hands." But even as David spoke those words, his mind raced with contingency plans. He knew how these things could play out, how powerful people could manipulate the system to protect their own. Crowley's suspension was a step, but it wasn't the end. If Crowley fought back, David had to be ready. Meanwhile, Crowley's world was unraveling. The suspension had stripped him of his badge and gun, but it wasn't just his career on the line, it was his entire identity. The man who had once walked the streets of Brookhaven with an air of untouchable authority now found himself an outcast. His phone rang constantly, calls from colleagues and union representatives offering advice, cautioning him to stay quiet. But Crowley wasn't one to stay quiet. In the dim light of his living room, surrounded by unopened boxes of his belongings from the station, Crowley sat with a glass of whiskey in hand. His face was drawn, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. Across from him sat his lawyer, a sharp-dressed man named Richard Kane. "This isn't just about you anymore," Kane said, leaning forward. "This article has people digging into the entire department. If you go down, you won't be the only one." Crowley scowled. "So what do you suggest? Sit back and let them destroy me?" "No," Kane replied, his tone measured. "But we need to be strategic. Right now, the public sees you as the villain. If we're going to change that narrative, we need to find leverage." "Leverage," Crowley repeated, his jaw tightening. "Against who? The journalist? That FBI guy?" Kane smirked faintly. "Exactly. Thompson may have started this, but he's not untouchable. Everyone has skeletons in their closet." Crowley leaned back, his mind racing. David Thompson had taken everything from him, or so he believed. If there was a way to fight back, to regain control, he would take it. Whatever it cost. The next day, as David prepared for another meeting with community leaders, his phone buzzed with a text. He glanced at the screen and froze. The message was from an unknown number, but the content was unmistakable, a photo of Maya at school, walking to class, with the words, "Watch your step." David's blood ran cold. He stared at the message, his mind racing. It was a threat, subtle but clear, and it confirmed what he had suspected: Crowley wasn't done. "Maya," he called, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. She appeared in the doorway, her expression curious. "What's up?" "I need you to stay home today," he said, standing and slipping his phone into his pocket. "Why? Did something happen?" David hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. "Just a precaution. I need to check on something, but I don't want you out of the house until I'm sure everything's fine." Maya's brow furrowed. "Dad, you're scaring me. What's going on?" David placed a hand on her shoulder, meeting her gaze. "Nothing you need to worry about. I've got it under control." But Maya wasn't convinced. She could see the tension in his jaw, the way his hand lingered protectively on her shoulder. "This is about Crowley, isn't it?" David didn't answer directly. Instead, he said, "Stay inside. Lock the doors. I'll be back soon." Maya nodded reluctantly, watching as he grabbed his jacket and keys. Once he was gone, she sat at the kitchen table, her mind racing. She hated feeling helpless, like a pawn in a game she didn't fully understand. But more than that, she hated the idea of her father facing danger alone. David drove to the police station, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. He parked a block away, scanning the street for anything out of place before stepping inside. The tension in the building was palpable. Officers who had once greeted him with casual familiarity now offered stiff nods or avoided his gaze altogether. David headed straight for the captain's office, his jaw set. "Thompson," the captain said as David entered, his tone wary. "What brings you here?" David didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Crowley's been sending threats." The captain's brow furrowed. "Are you sure?" David pulled out his phone, showing the message. "Does this look ambiguous to you?" The captain studied the photo, his expression darkening. "We'll look into it." "That's not good enough," David said, his voice firm. "This man is a danger to my family, and he's still out there. I want him dealt with." The captain sighed. "You know how these things work, Thompson. It takes time." "Time isn't a luxury I have," David snapped. "If you won't act, I will." The two men stared each other down, the tension crackling in the air. Finally, the captain relented. "I'll see what I can do. But be careful, Thompson. Don't let this get personal." David left the station, his frustration mounting. He knew the captain's words were empty, a bureaucratic attempt to placate him. If he wanted real action, he would have to take matters into his own hands. As he drove home, David's phone buzzed again. Another unknown number, another message: "You can't protect her forever." His grip on the wheel tightened. This wasn't just about Crowley's desperation, it was a calculated attempt to unnerve him, to force his hand. David's mind raced as he parked outside his house. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. And if Crowley wanted a fight, he had no idea what he was up against. David's mind was a storm of calculations as he entered his house. The door clicked shut behind him, and he leaned against it for a moment, letting the silence of the home calm his racing thoughts. Maya appeared from the kitchen, her expression a mix of concern and relief. "You're back," she said, walking toward him. "Did you figure out what's going on?" "I'm working on it," he said, his voice steady but laced with urgency. "Maya, I need you to understand something. This situation, it's dangerous. Crowley's not someone who plays fair, and he's feeling cornered." Maya frowned, crossing her arms. "So what do we do? Just let him get away with it?" "No," David replied firmly. "But we need to be smart. He's desperate, which makes him unpredictable. That's when people like him make mistakes." Maya hesitated, then nodded. "Okay. What do you need me to do?" "Stay here. Stay alert. Don't answer the door for anyone, and keep your phone with you at all times," David instructed. "I'll handle the rest." She gave him a reluctant nod, watching as he disappeared into his office. Once inside, David closed the door and began laying out the pieces of the puzzle. He replayed Crowley's threats in his mind, trying to predict his next move. The man was dangerous, yes, but also arrogant. That arrogance might be the key to turning the tables once and for all. David made a series of calls, reaching out to trusted contacts who could help him track Crowley's recent activity. As the hours ticked by, a picture began to form, a network of low-level informants and enablers who had helped Crowley maintain his grip on power over the years. But what caught David's attention was a single name, someone Crowley had relied on in the past to handle sensitive situations. If Crowley was planning something, this person might know what it was. The following evening, David parked his car in the shadows of a nondescript diner on the edge of town. The man he was meeting, a former police informant named Ray, was already seated in a booth near the back. Ray was jittery, his eyes darting toward the door every few seconds as if expecting trouble. "You're late," Ray muttered as David slid into the booth. "Traffic," David replied curtly. "Let's cut to the chase. You worked with Crowley before. What's he up to?" Ray hesitated, glancing around nervously. "I don't know what you're talking about." David leaned forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Don't play games with me, Ray. I know how Crowley operates, and I know you've been part of his little side deals. If you want to stay out of trouble, now's the time to start talking." Ray sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. All right. Crowley's pissed, man. He's been calling in favors, trying to dig up dirt on you. He's saying you're the reason his life's falling apart. And?" David pressed. "And he's not just sitting around waiting for the investigation to take him down," Ray said. "He's planning something. I don't know all the details, but he's been asking about your family. About your daughter." David's jaw tightened. "What else?" Ray shook his head. "That's all I've got. Look, I don't want to get in the middle of this. Crowley's dangerous, and if he finds out I talked to you, you did the right thing," David said, standing. "Stay out of his way, and you won't have to worry about him." As David left the diner, his mind raced. The mention of Maya sent a fresh wave of urgency coursing through him. Crowley was escalating, and it was only a matter of time before he made his move. But David wouldn't wait for that to happen. He had a plan. Back at home, Maya was in her room, scrolling through her phone when she heard a knock at the front door. She froze, her father's warnings echoing in her mind. The knock came again, more insistent this time. "Maya?" a voice called. It wasn't her father's, but it was familiar. "It's Olivia. Open up." Maya hesitated, her hand hovering over the lock. "Why are you here?" "My dad said not to open the door for anyone." "It's fine." Olivia's voice was muffled but urgent. "I just need to talk to you." "Please, Maya." Against her better judgment, Maya unlocked the door, opening it just a crack. Olivia stood on the porch, her face pale. But before Maya could say anything, a figure stepped out of the shadows behind her friend. It was Crowley. Maya gasped, slamming the door shut, but Crowley was quicker. He shoved his shoulder against it, forcing it open. Olivia screamed, backing away as Crowley stepped into the house. "Get away from her!" Maya shouted, retreating toward the kitchen. Crowley smirked, his eyes cold and calculating. "Relax, kid. I'm not here to hurt you. I just want to have a little chat." "Get out!" Maya yelled, grabbing a knife from the counter. "I mean it." Crowley raised his hands mockingly. All right. No need to get dramatic. Just give your dad a message for me, he doesn't scare me." At that moment, headlights flashed through the window as a car pulled into the driveway. Crowley cursed under his breath, backing toward the door. "We'll finish this later," he said before slipping out into the night. David burst through the door seconds later, his eyes scanning the room. "Maya. Are you okay?" "He was here," Maya said, her voice shaking. Crowley was here. David's face darkened. He wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. "It's over," he said, though his voice carried a steely edge. "He's made his last mistake." As Maya clung to him, David's mind was already racing. Crowley had crossed a line, and now it was time to end this once and for all. David sat at the edge of Maya's bed, watching her as she finally drifted to sleep. The tension in her face softened, but the faint crease in her brow remained, a mark of the fear she had experienced earlier that evening. He exhaled slowly, his fists clenched as he replayed the scene over and over in his mind. Crowley had invaded his home, threatened his family. The line had been crossed. This wasn't just about justice anymore. It was personal. In the silence of the house, David retreated to his office. His desk was a mess of papers, open files, and his laptop glowing faintly in the dim light. He opened it, navigating to a private database accessible only to FBI agents. His fingers moved swiftly, pulling up every piece of data he could find on Crowley, his addresses, his contacts, his patterns. A text buzzed on his phone, pulling his attention away. It was Sarah. "Got a tip. Crowley's been seen meeting with someone at the old factory near the docks. Could be planning something. Be careful." David stared at the message, his jaw tightening. The old factory had been abandoned for years, a relic of the town's industrial past. If Crowley was there, it meant he was already working on his next move. David didn't have time to wait for local law enforcement to act. They had proven too slow, too indecisive. This was his fight now. Grabbing his jacket, David quietly left the house, checking the locks on the doors and windows before stepping into the cold night. The drive to the docks was silent, his thoughts a whirlwind of strategy and rage. When he arrived, he parked a few blocks away, keeping his car hidden from view. The factory loomed in the distance, its broken windows reflecting the moonlight. David approached cautiously, his senses heightened. As he neared the building, he heard voices, low and urgent. He pressed himself against the wall, inching closer to an open window. Inside, Crowley stood with two other men, their postures tense. "This isn't just about me anymore," Crowley was saying, his voice sharp. "They're trying to take us all down. Thompson's making it personal." One of the men, a burly figure with a shaved head, grunted. "What do you want us to do? Scare him off?" "No," Crowley snapped. "He's not the kind of man you can scare. We need leverage. Something he can't ignore." David's stomach twisted as he listened, his mind racing. Leverage. They were planning to use Maya, or worse, the information they had on her, to force his hand. He couldn't let that happen. Before he could plan his next move, his phone vibrated in his pocket. The faint buzz felt deafening in the stillness of the night. Crowley's head snapped toward the window, his hand reaching for the gun holstered at his hip. "Who's there?" Crowley barked, stepping closer. David cursed under his breath, slipping away from the window and pressing himself into the shadows. His heart pounded in his chest as he moved silently around the building. Crowley stepped outside, his eyes scanning the darkness. "Thompson," he called out, his voice echoing. "I know you're here. Why don't you come out and face me like a man?" David didn't respond. He needed to draw Crowley away from the others, to isolate him. Carefully, he picked up a piece of loose metal and tossed it toward the far end of the yard. The clatter echoed, and Crowley turned, his gun raised. "You think you're clever?" Crowley growled, heading toward the sound. "You can't outsmart me, Thompson." David waited until Crowley was a few steps away before stepping out of the shadows, his voice calm and controlled. "Put the gun down, Crowley. This ends now." Crowley turned, a twisted grin spreading across his face. "You think you're in control here? You're not." "I don't need control," David said, his eyes locked on Crowley. "I just need you to listen. You've already lost, Crowley. The department has turned against you, the town knows who you are, and now, you've made it personal. You've threatened my family." Crowley's grip on the gun tightened. "You're the one who made it personal when you dragged my name through the mud. You think you're better than me? You think your badge makes you righteous?" "It's not about the badge," David replied. "It's about accountability. Something you've avoided your entire career." Crowley let out a bitter laugh. "Spare me the lecture. You're no saint, Thompson. You've done things, made compromises, just like the rest of us." David took a slow step forward, his hands raised. "Maybe I have. But the difference is, I'm not afraid to face the consequences of my actions. Can you say the same?" For a moment, Crowley hesitated, the weight of David's words hanging in the air. Then, his expression hardened. "You don't get to win," he snarled, raising the gun. But before he could pull the trigger, the sound of sirens filled the night. Flashing lights illuminated the factory yard as police cars surrounded the building. David had called for backup before leaving home, ensuring Crowley wouldn't have the chance to escape. Crowley froze, his eyes darting toward the approaching officers. "You set me up," he hissed. "No," David said, his voice steady. "You set yourself up." The officers moved in swiftly, their guns drawn. "Drop the weapon," one of them commanded. For a moment, Crowley looked like he might fight back. But then his shoulders slumped, and he let the gun fall to the ground. The officers moved in, handcuffing him as he glared at David. "This isn't over," Crowley spat. "You think this changes anything?" David stepped closer, his expression unreadable. "It changes everything." As Crowley was led away, David felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion wash over him. The immediate threat was gone, but the fight wasn't over. There would be questions, investigations, and repercussions to navigate. But for the first time, David felt like the tide had turned. When he returned home that night, Maya was waiting for him in the living room. She jumped up as he walked through the door, her eyes searching his face. "Is it over?" she asked, her voice tentative. David nodded, pulling her into a hug. "For now. But we're not done yet." She looked up at him, her brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" "It means we keep fighting," David said. For the truth, for justice, and for everyone who's ever been in your shoes. Maya nodded, her grip tightening around him. In that moment, David realized that the fight wasn't just about Crowley or the system that had enabled him. It was about setting an example for Maya, showing her that even in the face of adversity, standing up for what's right mattered. David's morning began with the faint hum of Maya's footsteps above him, a sound that had always been a comfort but now carried a weight of vigilance. The events of the previous days had shifted everything. Crowley was in custody, but David knew better than to believe the battle was entirely over. The justice system had a way of bending under pressure, and Crowley had connections that couldn't be ignored. As he poured himself a cup of coffee, the scent filling the kitchen, Maya descended the stairs. Her expression was still cautious, her movements deliberate as if testing the safety of her own home. "Morning," David said, forcing a sense of normalcy into his tone. Maya sat at the table, cradling a glass of orange juice. "Morning." They shared a moment of silence, the kind that lingered not out of comfort but from the unspoken heaviness of everything unsaid. Maya finally broke it. "Is he going to stay in jail?" she asked, her voice soft but pointed. David set his mug down, meeting her gaze. "For now, yes. But it's not a guarantee." Maya frowned. "How is that fair? He broke into our house, threatened us. How can someone like that not stay locked up?" "Because the system doesn't always work the way it should," David admitted, his voice steady but firm. "But we've done everything we can to hold him accountable. Now, we have to trust the process." "That's hard to do," Maya muttered, looking away. David reached across the table, placing a hand over hers. "I know. But the truth is on our side, and the evidence is strong. That's what matters." Maya nodded, though the doubt in her eyes remained. She wasn't convinced, and truthfully, neither was David. But he knew they had to believe in something, even if the outcome felt precarious. Later that day, David met with Sarah at a quiet cafe on the edge of town. She had been instrumental in bringing Crowley's misdeeds to light, but now they needed to ensure the story didn't lose momentum. "People are still talking about the article," Sarah said, sipping her coffee. "But with Crowley behind bars, the media is starting to lose interest. They want a bigger story." David frowned. "A bigger story? What could be bigger than systemic abuse and corruption?" Sarah leaned forward, her voice low. "You know how this works, David. Stories like this have a short shelf life unless something keeps them alive. If Crowley gets out on bail, it'll make headlines again. But if he stays in custody, people will move on. And that's a bad thing?" David asked. "Not if you're okay with the department quietly sweeping the rest under the rug," Sarah replied. "Crowley is just one piece of the puzzle. If we stop now, nothing changes." David rubbed his temple, the weight of her words settling on him. "So what do we do?" "We dig deeper," Sarah said simply. "Crowley's connections, his enablers, there's more here. I can feel it." David exhaled, his mind racing. "If we go down this road, we have to be prepared for what we find. This won't just expose Crowley. It could bring the whole department under scrutiny." "That's the point," Sarah said, her eyes unwavering. "Are you ready for that?" David nodded slowly. "I don't think we have a choice." Back at home, Maya was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone when she received a notification. It was an article, an op-ed defending Crowley. Her stomach twisted as she read the words, which painted him as a victim of a smear campaign orchestrated by overzealous activists and biased media. The writer called into question the validity of the evidence, suggesting that Crowley had been unfairly targeted. "Dad!" Maya called, her voice sharp. David appeared in the doorway, his expression immediately alert. "What is it?" She handed him her phone. "Look at this." David read the article, his jaw tightening with each sentence. When he finished, he set the phone down, his anger barely contained. This is exactly what I was worried about. How can they say that? Maya asked, her voice trembling. How can they just lie like that? Because they're not interested in the truth, David said. They're interested in protecting their own. Crowley's not just fighting for himself, he's part of something bigger. And they're not going to let him go down without a fight. Maya shook her head, her frustration boiling over. It's not fair. None of this is fair. David sat beside her, his voice calm but firm. I know it's not. But that's why we can't stop now. They're trying to intimidate us, to make us doubt ourselves. We can't let them win. Maya nodded, though her frustration didn't dissipate. What do we do now? David thought for a moment before answering. We keep going. Sarah and I are digging deeper into Crowley's connections. There's more to this story, and if we can uncover it, we can bring the whole system to its knees. As the days passed, the tension in Brookhaven grew. Protests erupted outside the police station, with community members demanding accountability not just for Crowley but for the entire department. Counter-protesters showed up too, waving signs that read, "Support our police," and "Justice for Crowley." The town was divided, and the air crackled with tension. David attended one of the protests with Maya by his side. As they stood among the crowd, holding signs and chanting, a man approached them. He was tall and broad, wearing a police union hat and a scowl. "You Thompson?" the man asked, his tone aggressive. David turned to face him, his expression calm but firm. "I am." The man sneered. "You think you're some kind of hero, don't you? Dragging a good man's name through the mud." "A good man doesn't abuse his power," David replied evenly. "And he certainly doesn't threaten children." The man stepped closer, his voice low and dangerous. "You'd better watch yourself. People around here don't take kindly to outsiders stirring up trouble." David didn't flinch. "The only trouble here is the corruption you're trying to protect. And I won't stop until it's exposed." The man glared at him for a moment before turning and walking away, his shoulders tense. Maya watched him go, her heart pounding. "Do you think he'll come after us?" she asked. David shook his head. "He's just trying to scare us. But we won't let him." As the protest continued, David couldn't shake the feeling that the situation was reaching a boiling point. The fight wasn't just about Crowley anymore, it was about an entire system that was resisting change. And David knew that the closer they got to the truth, the harder those in power would fight to keep it hidden. The courtroom was silent, the air thick with anticipation. David sat beside Sarah at the plaintiff's table, his face calm but focused. Across the room, Crowley sat with his defense attorney, his jaw clenched and eyes filled with defiance. The trial had been grueling, weeks of testimony and evidence that painted a damning picture of Crowley's actions and the systemic failures that had allowed him to operate unchecked. But today was the final day, and the verdict was imminent. The judge re-entered the room, her expression unreadable. The jurors followed, their faces betraying nothing as they took their seats. David stole a glance at Maya, seated in the gallery beside Olivia. She gave him a small, reassuring nod, her quiet strength bolstering his own. "Will the foreperson please rise?" the judge said. A woman stood, holding a piece of paper that seemed to carry the weight of the world. She cleared her throat. "In the case of the state versus Ethan Crowley, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty on all counts." The words seemed to echo in the room, followed by a collective intake of breath. Crowley's face twisted in disbelief, his attorney leaning in to whisper frantically. Across the room, Maya let out a shaky exhale, her hand flying to her mouth as relief washed over her. David closed his eyes for a moment, his shoulders relaxing for the first time in weeks. The judge addressed the court, her voice firm. "Ethan Crowley, you have been found guilty of abuse of power, harassment, and multiple counts of falsifying reports. You will be remanded into custody immediately and sentenced at a later date. Court is adjourned. As the gavel struck, the room erupted into a flurry of movement and sound. David stood, turning to embrace Maya as she rushed toward him. "We did it," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "It's over." "It's over for now," David corrected gently. "But this is just the beginning." Later that evening, the family gathered at home, their small living room filled with a warmth that hadn't been there in weeks. Olivia joined them, along with Sarah, who had become a steadfast ally throughout the ordeal. Maya sat on the couch, her legs tucked beneath her as she scrolled through her phone. "Everyone's talking about it," she said, showing David the screen. "They're calling it a turning point." David nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's a victory, but we have to make sure it leads to real change. Crowley was part of a larger problem. Taking him down is just the first step." Sarah leaned forward, holding her mug of tea. "The article did more than just expose Crowley, it sparked a movement. People are coming forward, sharing their stories. The pressure on the department is mounting." David gave her a small smile. "That's because of you. You took a risk writing that piece." Sarah shook her head. "It was your fight, David. I just helped bring it to light." Maya looked up, her expression serious. "Do you think they'll actually change? The system, I mean." David considered her question carefully. "Change is slow, Maya. It doesn't happen overnight. But this is a start. And as long as people like you keep fighting, it will keep getting better." Maya smiled, a flicker of hope returning to her eyes. "Then I'll keep fighting." In the days that followed, the fallout from the trial continued to ripple through Brookhaven. The police department announced sweeping reforms, spurred by public outcry and pressure from state officials. Several officers resigned, their complicity in Crowley's actions laid bare. The town, once divided, began to heal as more voices joined the call for justice and accountability. Crowley, stripped of his power and reputation, faced a long prison sentence. The man who had once terrorized the community now sat alone in a cold cell, his arrogance reduced to bitterness. For David, seeing Crowley brought to justice wasn't about revenge, it was about closure. He had fought not just for Maya but for every person who had been silenced by fear and oppression. Maya, too, found herself transformed by the experience. She returned to school with her head held high, no longer defined by the incident but empowered by her role in exposing the truth. She became a voice for change among her peers, organizing discussions and events that addressed issues of racism and inequality. Her courage inspired others to speak out, creating a ripple effect that reached far beyond Brookhaven. As for David, he returned to his work at the FBI with a renewed sense of purpose. He had always believed in justice, but this experience had reminded him of the power of persistence and community. He continued to support Maya's efforts, proud of the young woman she was becoming. On a quiet evening weeks later, David and Maya sat on the porch, the stars glittering above them. Maya pointed out constellations, her voice filled with wonder and curiosity. David listened, a sense of peace settling over him. "Dad," Maya said suddenly, turning to look at him. "Do you think Mom would be proud of us?" David's throat tightened, but he nodded. "She'd be more than proud. She'd be amazed." Maya smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. Together, they sat in silence, the weight of the past weeks finally lifting as they looked toward the future. As we reflect on this story, it's impossible not to think about the strength it takes to stand up against injustice, especially when the odds feel stacked against you. David and Maya's journey wasn't just about exposing one man's corruption, it was about holding a mirror up to a broken system and demanding better. It reminds us that real change requires courage, persistence, and the willingness to fight for what's right, even when it feels like the world is against you. What do you think about their story? Have you ever faced a situation where you had to stand up for what you believed in? Let us know in the comments, we'd love to hear your thoughts. If this story moved you, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to Tales of Twist for more powerful narratives that challenge and inspire. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.